What is going on, everybody, and happy Wednesday. I'm Omar Khatib, your host and head of state for the state of MedTech. Hope you're all doing well. So we have a nice afternoon session. And hey, look at that. I love when I log on and I'm introducing this and I just see those numbers go up. So I see a lot of people joining us. And of course, I love, these are people who've watched the show before. I haven't even said anything. You guys know how the show goes. Drop in the comments where you're joining from. All right, we still got some couple of faces we do recognize. Hey, Barbara joining from Huntington Beach. The great Ken Husted. Ken, thank you so much for joining from San Antonio, Texas. Thank you all for joining us. So today's episode and show is an interesting one. And actually, I'm surprised that I haven't covered it yet with somebody. But for those of you who work in the world of capital equipment, right, selling, let's say, robotic platforms, navigation systems, etc., the most important part of the product adoption isn't necessarily the sale of the technology to the hospital or clinic. That's just the start. The real definition of whether your technology will be successful is the utilization of it. For somebody like Ken Husted, who was a leader over at Missouri Robotics, where I first started my career, that was the first thing that he and the leadership there taught us, which is you can't afford to have a dead system in a hospital, right? Because people talk, right? And of course, if let's say your capital equipment is not being utilized, not only is that a risk to your revenue, it's a risk to your market as well. Because if a user is not using the technology often, that means that when they do decide to use it, they may not have been, they might have forgotten their training, etc. A couple other people, Jeffrey Beecher, thanks, joining from Virginia. So to cover this topic, right, it really goes back to the importance of your training and education department and sales training specifically. So a very good friend of mine, a close friend, an old friend of mine, Colin Forward, who's the CEO of a very fantastic technology company called Ology, specifically has a platform that helps companies essentially do training at scale. I'm going to bring him on in a moment and he'll tell a little bit more about the company. But we're going to do this kind of like a fireside. So I have some questions for Colin. We're going to cover some topics. But of course, for you, the audience, feel free to drop questions in the comments. Or if you're brave enough, if you're extroverted enough, go ahead and drop a message in the comments and say that you'll come on live. I'll shoot you a message with the studio link and we'll bring you on live so you can get some pre-advice live from an expert. So let me bring on my friend Colin Ford. Colin, can you hear us? Can you see us?
I can. How's it going, Omar?
Doing great. Colin, thank you so much for taking time to join us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So Colin, before we kind of get into it, if you could give us a little bit about your background and more importantly, the story of Ology, how it started and what do you guys do now and how do you help companies drive utilization through better training?
Sure. So we started a fair bit ago. It was 2010. We were at a research lab at the Institute for Simulation and Training at UCF in Orlando. And at the time, we were studying the difference between mobile learning and desktop learning. And the cliff notes of that is that we realized that mobile learning was much better at helping someone go out into the field to do their job. Whereas for traditional e-learning, someone might sit down at a desk, learn how to do something, and then have to carry that into their work. But a lot of times, just like a classroom, you forget a lot of what you learn right after you've been through the course. So, this is, like I said, 2010. So iPhone came out in 2007. First Android was 2008. And at the time, we weren't even really focused on healthcare. We were doing a lot of work overseas. We were supporting adult learners in places like Kenya and India, where mobile technology was making education much more accessible. And in the course of that work, we also started doing some research with the Department of Defense and groups that would become the Defense Health Agency. And we realized that mobile learning was a real resource for people in the clinical field and or in clinical fields, and also for folks like police departments that we support with groups like LAPD. Anyone really that has to have a job support tool on their person when they're out in the field doing their job. So first 8 years or so was a lot of R&D, a lot of contract development for groups that were looking to build distributed learning programs. And then in the course of that work, we built a platform that we call Capillary. The metaphor there being that you have the heart of your organization, the subject matter experts that need to get essential information out to the furthest reaches of your organization, and then ideally understand how that information is being used and accessed and helping people improve the work that they're doing. So now we have a few 100,000 users. The most prominent program that we're supporting is called Deployed Medicine. It's the official outlet for all combat medicine training. You can go to deployedmedicine.com, or you can find the apps on iOS and Android. And then I mentioned LAPD. We have several large med device companies that we support, several large hospitals that are using us for employee onboarding, compliance, and just all around excellence in workforce development. And we even have some patient-facing programs that are still very early stage. But when we're talking about training, we're really talking about behavior change. So that does have plenty of applications in the patient space as well. So I think that's kind of the short history of ology.
Fantastic. Now, and you said something very important, which is behavior change, and it's something that's often said in the medtech industry, which is, somebody in leadership is going to say, "Oh, we're in the business of changing behavior," but very few people actually understand what the hell that means or how to actually do it. And I think that it really goes back to training, not only better training of your field sales force, but essentially how do they train the surgeons, right? Like in the case of surgical technology, how do they train surgeons to use these technologies? One thing that made me more interested in ology than other companies is that while you guys do help a lot of different medtech companies, you have a variety of industries you work with, like you mentioned the police forces, right? Where you can essentially take best practices and apply it in this industry, because unfortunately the best practices in this industry, they're really not that great. So on the training side, like, where does it start? Is it more important to have the better training platform and approaches with your field sales force, or do you start with how those people are training the surgeons? Like, where does this all begin?
Yeah, so that question comes up a lot, especially with some of the really large organizations that we're supporting, because things get siloed, right? And so different departments end up taking responsibility for their own training, and the groups that seem to be most successful are the ones that incorporate training into. They might have either a central training group that embeds in each different business unit, or they have subject matter experts throughout the organization that are given access to the essential tools and resources for implementing really high quality training programs. So, one thing that we try and coach people on is you can get through any number of layers of a bureaucracy of an organization with 2 courses. And so in the med device space, that's generally like a product course. So you imagine the training that you're going to give to your end user that tells them how to use the product, when to use the product, any contraindications, anything like that. And then also, generically speaking, a train the trainer course. But you might also just think of it as like a sales training course where you're helping someone understand the value proposition, not just of the product itself, but also of the training that you're bringing to them. And so the way that works is that with just those 2 courses, everyone takes the first one. Everyone has to know how the product works, how to use it, when to use it, that kind of thing. And then every layer of your organization, all the way down to your end user, should take the train the trainer course, so that they then internalize that value proposition and they're able to not just become advocates for the product itself, but also deliver that content to an audience that trusts them. Because a lot of the times, if you're just getting put through some sort of like mandated compliance training, you might be the end user and you have someone on high that's handed down this requirement that you have to go through this course. Well, what we find is that it's really the trust relationships that drive accountability and drive change in an organization. So if it's your direct manager that's been through this program and then is able to hand that off to you, we find that people are much more receptive to it. And, they're going to ask questions. They're going to dive into the content. They're not just going to like click through it and then figure that's it. So that's one of the kind of quick tricks we find that works no matter how an organization is configured around like where their training function lives, is just making sure that you have the foundational content, which is a lot of times what goes through Marcom, what gets the approval for being official product training. And then you have the sales training and the marketing content that wraps around it that offers that value proposition, but can also go all the way out to the end user.
Interesting. So can you kind of walk us through maybe like an example of that? And by the way, if you need to do it, if you need to go somewhere online, either you could share screen, or if it's easier, if it's something that's online, that's public, you can tell me, I can share my screen and we can just go straight to it. So where do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. So I think, I can definitely explain, I can provide some examples. But I realize, after I finish my last answer, I should probably provide a little bit more of the why. A lot of people that are listening in, they probably have had to do in-services. They probably had to, fly out somewhere.
We live and die by that.
Right. Yeah. And it's getting a little easier again now, but for the last few years, it's been harder than ever to get face-to-face with your customers.
Very. And just before I forget, here's my question to you, because like I feel that, even me when I was at Petra, when we were doing in-service training, right? We sometimes couldn't go physically to the hospital, right? And so at the time during COVID, everyone just, started to use Zoom. And of course, that's why Zoom's stock like just blew up. But I feel like now in 2022, like it feels just very antiquated and kind of, it just feels like I don't know how to say, it's just a crappy experience to do like an in-service, and it's like, hey, let's just do this through Zoom. Am I being, is that a little too harsh for me to say? I just feel like it's really crappy.
Even before COVID, I was a big advocate of, using technology to augment the training that you're already doing. You're not going to replace face-to-face. Being on Zoom and having to pay attention to something that really should be hands-on is exhausting. So even before COVID, that was best practices. And I've had people recently, I've had like large med device customers tell me, you know what, we just want to replace our in-service training with remote. I'm like, no, please don't. Like, I understand that it's expensive and it's a pain, but what we can do is make it much more valuable and make it so you have to do it less often.
So you're essentially advocating not a complete replacement of just doing remote. You're saying that the process just needs to be augmented. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the biggest mistake that people make with in-service training is that a lot of the times the people that they're training, it's the first time that they're getting exposed to the content. And
right. Very first time.
Yeah. So very, very common sort of pedagogical concept is the flipped classroom. So even primary schools are using this strategy more and more often, where the didactic material, the stuff that is just kind of, lectured at a student, or the material that they have to absorb before they can really think critically, that happens outside the classroom. And that's one of the things that you can do with distance learning technology is you can introduce someone to the material beforehand, whatever knowledge they need to ask more informed questions, they should enter the face-to-face in-service with. And in that way, if you have, just a couple hours with these people, they've already got questions in mind. They've already ideally put hands on the product, and you're going to get much more value out of that time with them. And they're going to remember the conversations that you have much more than if they were just supposed to sit there and listen to you.
And that makes a lot of sense. And I think, there's this concept. So for me, like being in sales and marketing, persuasion is something that I'm very, obviously very into. And one of the keys to persuasion is this principle of persuasion, which is what are you going to do before the point of persuasion? What I see a lot of MedTech companies do is that, when you do an in-service, the first mistake is assuming that, okay, just because the hospital bought it, it's like, oh great, it's going to be used. No, you actually have to persuade people who in the in-service as to why is this a great technology, why is it going to make their lives better, right? Because a lot of these people, whether it's a surgical tech or a nurse, they're not getting paid more money to learn about your technology and implement it, right? It's actually, if anything, it's a pain for them, because it's just like it's one more thing. And if let's say your company has a great quarter, right? You hit all these goals. You have multiple in-services going on. There's no guarantee that they're all going to be done well. It's kind of like really up in the air. And then, a year later, the company's struggling because they're wondering like, well, this one hospital was really excited about adopting the technology, and they're at 20% utilization, and it's like killing our market because no other hospital is going to adopt, right?
Right.
So what you're saying is using remote mobile training ahead of time to educate the person, like, if you're going to make a first impression, do that first, so that when you do the in-person, it's shorter, it's more high level, and then the behavior changes has a better chance of actually happening. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's not just that it's more likely to bring about behavior change. It's that when you're face to face with that person, they're going to be more invested. They're going to be able to say, "Hey, so I saw this in the training, but I have questions," and then you're going to answer those questions, and it's going to become something that's much more crystallized, much more impactful knowledge to them. And the other thing is that I think the way that you described it is right, with caveats. So one thing that I've run into a lot of the times is people say, well, we have a website with training. And we say, okay, who's using it? And they say, well, we don't really know. We've just, hung up a bunch of PDFs or PowerPoints or something like that. And you go, okay, well, you don't really know how much of that training is being used. You don't know how effective it is. There's not really any sort of measurement, any data that is there to help you make informed investments in your training and the way that you're doing your product support.
I mean, I see a lot of people. There's more people. Hey, everybody, if you just joined, feel free to drop in the chat. Hey, Dr. Verdon, if you feel like dropping in the chat what city you're joining from, please feel free to. But if you have a question for Colin, go ahead and drop in the chat. I'll ask it, or we'll highlight it. But Colin, that's actually a really important point you just brought up, because, at least in the surgical robotics world, that's, usually the analogy I go to. When after you do a training, right? If an account is struggling, this is back in 2013, 2014. The problem was we had no idea on, what was the reason. Is it because the surgeons using it had, they didn't do a good job in their training and they forgot how to use it? Is it the scrub tech? Like, we just had no idea. And so because that lack of data, the reason always came back to the hospital would say, well, it's the company's fault and it's the technology. And sometimes that's true, but a lot of times it was a user error, right? And it's a really hard conversation to have, because it's like, no, there's nothing wrong with the product. It's that your surgeon or your team's not using it well. But that's a really good point, because when you have that data that, let's say through ology you provide, it's just a lot more objective. And it's kind of two parties being able to look at the data and say, okay, well, this is the facts of what's happening is happening. So how do we fix it, right?
Yeah, and so you kind of shifted to post in service there, right? And there's a whole different set of problems that you're trying to tackle, because it might be the case that someone went through the training, and here I will share something to kind of illustrate this point. Let's see. So there's this phenomenon called the
and you're not sharing your screen yet, by the way.
Yep, I'm working on it.
Okay.
Want to make sure I'm sharing the right one. Let's see if that'll work. How about now?
Nothing yet.
Okay. Well, I might just give up on the screen share for now, because I'm not doing it on Chrome. That might be the issue. But anyways, there's this phenomenon called
if you want to email, if there's something you could email to me, I could try it as well.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, try that.
So
this is a very laid back show, So we have like the best audience. People have seen like really terrible technical AV errors happen on this show. I've got those all taken care of by this point. So like for like a little bit of a delay, it's like, oh yeah, it's cool.
Awesome.
Yeah, we're very casual.
Well, yeah, this is, even if you were to Google the forgetting curve or something like that, you would see a thousand different charts, a thousand different representations of it. And this isn't like new science. Herman Ebbinghaus described this in like the late 1800s. But it's the rate at which people forget something. And furthermore, it's the rate at which they forget something after they review it once, twice, three times. And so, all of us at some point crammed for a test in college,
Oh
and
yeah.
maybe we got a decent score on the test. But then, the final comes back around and you don't remember any of it and you have to study it again, right? Because we all know the best approach is spaced repetition to crystallize the knowledge and make sure that this is like something you're going to remember for your whole life. And so for the people who have gone through the training, you can also make sure that they've reviewed it, that they've gone back to it. And you're going to see that if you have both formal training pathways where you're giving someone a certificate and you're saying, okay, you have achieved competency, you've gotten through the course. And this is the really important part, you have on-demand, just-in-time training. And that means like 2 to at most 5 minutes worth of review so that someone can pull up a concept and review it and then go practice it. And we've proven that this works. We weren't the first, we weren't the last, but we did a study with the trauma residents at the University of Miami and some of the Army's forward surgical teams. And we showed that if they happened to get a hour-long lecture on a particular topic at the beginning of a week, just happened to have a topic on, a case that they had to do that week, then they performed as well or worse than if they had a 5-minute on-demand video that they could review when the EMTs called and said, "Hey, we have this case coming in."
Like just right before.
Right.
Oh, interesting. Kind of just like before a test, you just have some cliff notes just to remind you. Like, oh yeah, okay, I remember what to do now, and you just do it.
Right. So these residents and these Army surgical teams were able to pull. They were, the Army rotates through the Ryder Trauma Center in Miami, and they could pull up these mobile videos that show how to do a chest tube insertion or how to do any given procedure that might be coming through their facility. And they were performing better than those people that just got lucky and had that hour-long lecture at the beginning of the week. So, why would you depend on just maybe having that training recently when you can have that training on demand? And as a vendor, you're going to see who's accessing which training. So what is your most valuable content, and you can focus on making sure that that content stays relevant and stays like, if you have some things that are maybe like higher fidelity than others, that's where you're going to make your investment because that's what people are using. That's what they're gravitating towards.
Can you go more into that topic about seeing which pieces of content are used and how to leverage the data? Because this is one area where there's no class. I mean, I'm sure there is a class, but nobody goes through a class, at least in the MedTech industry, of how to look at data and decide what's important and what's not. So let's just imagine that a company has, let's say, 10 different modules, right? And 3 of them, get the majority of engagement, play and everything. The other 7 don't. What does the company do at that point? Do they focus on those 3 that's getting the most engagement and focus on updating that, making that a better experience, et cetera? Or should they split the time? Like, what do you do with something like that?
Yeah, it's both. So, I mean, it's a marketing issue, right? And I think a lot of people, when they're rolling out training programs, they kind of underestimate just how much marketing goes into training implementation. So on one hand, you need to listen to your audience. You need to understand what's important to them. And so, for example, our customers at the Defense Health Agency, I like to use them a lot because they have almost 200,000 users, and it's a global program. They do a really good job with it, and they've realized that people gravitate towards their tactical combat and casualty care content. I mean, I'll kind of put a point on it. The war in Ukraine started at the end of February. By March, Ukraine was our second highest population of users on deployed medicine. They have I think now they have about 5,000 active users, and they're going to the U.S. military's tactical combat and casualty care curriculum to learn how to do emergency medicine. They're not going to en route casualty care or canine casualty care or the COVID content, right? And so every quarter when the committee, the COTC meets, they focus very heavily on that particular curriculum because they know that it's not just the biggest addressable market in the DoD, but it's also the biggest addressable market in terms of partner nations that they're supporting. And even like EMTs, I'll run into people who work in emergency services around the US, and they'll pull out deployed medicine and show it to me and say, yeah, I use this all the time. And so they do focus on that. Now, on the other hand, that tells them that they need to focus a lot of their implementation and adoption efforts on the other areas of content that are just as important for saving lives, but maybe aren't getting the same sort of uptake because, it's higher level content, and maybe it requires a little bit more hand-holding to onboard a site and prepare the instructors to deliver that kind of training. So you do both. But of course, if you have like your really hot topic and your product that people love, you don't say, well, that's good, we'll just leave it there. You continue to invest in that, but then you also need to make sure that you're bringing people's attention to the stuff that you want them to kind of grow into.
Got it. So, on the same topic, one of the other things that is incredibly important, but becomes also quite expensive is internal training for employees. So like, in medicine or in MedTech compared to, let's say, the SaaS industry, for the SaaS industry, when you're selling software, you get onboarded, you spend a week like online, you check out things and you're good. And then, no offense to the SaaS industry, it's a much easier job because most of the salespeople, when they get on a demo call, they have the luxury of having, let's say, a sales engineer to come on and demo the product. They don't have to do any of these things. In medical sales, like, you have to do all of it, right? And so that doesn't leave a lot of time, but there's also a lot of training. So one of the people in my program just started a role, and she's spending so much time learning, getting through like technique guides, etc. And usually at some point, you fly people in for a week to your HQ, right? Which again, is timely, it takes time, it's expensive, etc. What do you do with something like that? Do you feel like for companies it makes sense to still have that in person, like where they come for a full week, or is it better where you use mobile learning and then you have them fly in for like a day or something and have that spread out? Like, I don't know if there's like a cookie cutter approach, but I'm just wondering what's your take on that.
Well, so I hesitate to be too prescriptive because I know that everyone's going to have a different use case, and in some cases it is going to make sense to do that intensive face-to-face. What I can say is that there are some really well proven strategies for distance learning that can help give you the flexibility to maybe improve the results that you're getting, whatever your training model is. So, for example, one of the big challenges that we see is what we call instructor drift or curriculum drift. So I know that this happens all the time in the med device industry, especially because a lot of the times people are using distributors.
Yes.
And
yeah. There's
a lot of rotation. There's people that, may or may not have seen the training. There's sometimes people selling competing products. And, you want to make sure that they're using standards-based content, because if they're just using like old marketing material or going to YouTube and finding something that's out of date, you're not going to get the best results. Again, another example from deployed medicine, this is a life or death situation. They found out that 25% of the deaths in Iraq and Afghanistan were preventable, and 80% of those were because of people using the wrong tourniquet protocol. And
oh my gosh.
That's because there was no standardized, canonized curriculum that people were using. And so they were, finding the information wherever they could. And so this is a problem that also pops up in learning technology too. The reason for that is because we're really committed to the classroom model. There's this joke about how if you took someone from 100 years ago into the current day and you just toured them around and you showed them different parts of the world, they would be so lost until you took them into a classroom and they go, oh, there's the podium and there's the chairs. And so this is a classroom. I know what this is. Well, the irony is that a lot of our learning technology is built on that model, and it carries a lot of the same problems with it, which is that you're now dependent on this instructor to be reliable, to have the most up-to-date information. So, the blackboards and canvases, and even some things like, well, I don't want to call anyone out in the health industry in particular, but there are a lot of like classroom-based learning management systems. And I think what's a best practice now is to create canon, to create standards-based content, and then make sure that you're equipping your distributed training workforce with that content. So you can guarantee that even if you're New York Presbyterian and you're using your apps at any number of campuses around the city, you can guarantee that your nurse trainers are using the standard content, and they're not, inserting their own material outside of like, whatever little bits of wisdom they want to use to contextualize the training. So, as long as you have a way to kind of protect the standard and then also distribute that out to the people who, again, are training someone who they have a relationship with, training someone who trusts them, then you're going to get the best results. Whether that means that you're using that to reduce the amount of time that they have to spend coming into a central location, or you're just augmenting the training program you have, that's going to get you the best results.
Got it. You said something. You used a term earlier. I want to go back to. You said standard-based content. Was that the term you used?
Yeah, I mean, standards-based training. Yeah, that's a big thing that we deal with a lot of the times. Whether it's the standard that a company establishes, or the standard that a center of excellence that they have in the military establishes. LAPD, it's LAPD University, and they're establishing the standard for de-escalation, use of force, implicit bias, that kind of thing. And it's important to have ways to kind of put that content on a pedestal and make it available to other people, because, the small military base in Alaska, or the tiny hospital that's part of a huge system, or the small police department in the Central Valley in California, they're not going to have the resources to put together the curriculum. And you don't want to ask them to, but in order to help them be successful in their job, you need to be effective at getting them that standards-based content, and then onboarding the instructors to do a good job with those local audiences.
Got it. What do you feel like is the common mistake that you see a lot of companies doing? I mean, we can start with MedTech, but just in general, like, because at least for the audience who are listening to this, the majority of them are going to be like founders and CEOs of like a Series A, B, or C company. We definitely have people who are the Medtronics instructors in the world, but for the people who are just like building their company and stuff, like, what are some common mistakes you can kind of avoid ahead of time?
Man, I have to say, there's a lot of different mistakes. I think the audience that you just described is probably less likely to make a lot of them. So that's good news. But I think probably the biggest one is trying to take material from a legacy training program, mm-hmm. and then using that to bootstrap a distributed training program. And the best example is just, whenever I'm in a room with people, I say, how many of you love using PowerPoints on your phone? And no one's going to raise their hand, right? And back in 2008, when I was really excited about my Android G1, I was like, man, I can't wait till PowerPoints are great to use on this thing, because I wanted to be a power user. And the truth is, that's just never going to be the way that you do it. So a lot of people are trying to take either classroom training or desktop training and then just push it out to a mobile device. And that's going to get you a terrible, terrible result.
Yeah, that's a great point. I never thought of it like that, actually.
On the other hand, if you build for mobile and you provide a learning experience that can be broken up into 3 to 5 minute intervals and is going to be viewable on pretty much any size screen, you can scale that up. So if you build for mobile first, which is a lot of times the case in software development too, but it also applies to training, you're going to get results in any format.
Interesting. And that's actually a really good point, because usually for a lot of MedTech companies, the way it starts is it's usually the founder who puts some PowerPoint together on how to do things, and then that ends up not being enough. And so they do like a Zoom, and then they record the Zoom, and it's all saved into like some Google Drive, which is fine if you're working from home on a desktop. But especially for the people who are out in the field, like it's a real pain in the ass to deal with that. Like, especially, I mean, I remember, and again, no offense to everybody at Mazor, like we didn't have a company like Ology or any other options at the time. But I remember when I was out in the field, if I had to review a technique, or just review anything before a case, it was a nightmare because I could not do it on my phone because it just, there's always issues with the way it looked, or I just, again, using PowerPoint on your phone is a pain. And then I had to pull out my laptop, and then at that point I had to find like Wi-Fi. So it's just like all kinds of issues.
Well, and you're highlighting a really important point, which is that your sales workforce is going to have a lot in common with your end users in a clinical setting when it comes to this kind of thing.
Oh, that's a great, I never thought it. You're absolutely right. That's
So,
actually a great point. Yeah, sorry, keep going on that.
yeah, they're a great test population. They're sort of a captive audience, right? They a lot of times have to do the training because you say to do the training, but they're probably going to have a similar workflow to someone that's walking the floor or going from case to case and has to pull up this kind of content. So beyond just having that in common, it's probably a good idea to roll out your training programs iteratively. And so I mentioned, you can get through any number of layers in an organization with those two training courses, with the core product course and the value proposition course. So start with your star salespeople. Start with a pilot population of a few really sharp people that are going to give you good feedback, that understand the product, and then go from there. And then have them be the trainer. Have them work with a group that trusts them.
Let me ask you this. So when you said start with your star salespeople, what does that mean? Like, can you describe the persona of who you should look for? Because who this usually falls on, most MedTech companies at a certain stage, they have like a trainer, but the trainer is usually just knees deep in, developing training materials, setting things up. And so, and for them, they really sometimes don't know who to go to. So this usually falls on marketing to figure out like, who can we roll this out to, right? So marketing is really, really quarterbacks a lot of stuff. Can you describe that persona of like a good salesperson to do this with?
Well,
Like, what are their characteristics?
I'll come at it at a slightly different scale. So one of the things I've seen work really well for some of our clients is that they go and they pick one of their favorite distributors. And it might be a distributor with a small team that they have really good lines of communication with. They get a lot of feedback. It's not always positive. This distributor might be one of the ones that says, hey, we really need more material. We need more collateral. We need more training and product support. That's the group that you want to respond to, because they're the squeaky wheel and you're going to give them that attention, but it also means that they care about it and they're going to give you constructive feedback. So that person that you're talking about that's knee deep in training, you're right. They're not the best person to test this on because they're probably so stuck in the loop of having to respond to the need that they're not going to do like really objective quality testing, product testing. But that person should definitely be working with your top salespeople who are demonstrably good at listening to the customers and understanding what is the difference between a customer who, buys a product, uses a product, and one that, maybe buys one and ages out or just doesn't utilize it. So depending on the size of the organization, maybe that's a team of like, 3 to 5 salespeople that helps you refine the content before you go enterprise wide. For really large organizations where they've had a big body of content, they have a training department that's already bringing them some of the training plans. They have a marketing team that has a lot of these beautiful training assets and videos and that kind of thing. Then maybe you start with one distributor that you trust really well, and you get the feedback from them, you refine it, and then you roll it out to a broader audience.
Got it. One thing that I wanted to ask you about, like specific tools, because even for me, like I have my own sales training program, and so for me, like for my purposes, like I use a platform like Kajabi. A MedTech company can't technically use it. It's it just doesn't make sense. But one of the things that also I feel like companies and sales, training departments get hung up on is the quality, not the quality of the content, but like the way it looks. And so they want to spend money, hire a videographer, which is all fine. But it ends up being really expensive. And then when you have to update materials, like you have to go through this whole production process. I'm wondering, like, what are your thoughts on using tools like Loom and just like I'm a big fan of it, especially if it has to be updated. But I'm just wondering, like, there's like a happy medium of like making it look good, but then like not,
Yeah, we could have a whole conversation just on content development, right? Like, I mean, you do a great job. I'm sure everyone that is listening in or watching this knows the content that you put out there, and you're just so consistent with it. There's a lot of restrictions that med device companies are under when it comes to the type of training material that they can provide. And I find that the red tape with Marcom and getting things approved and that kind of thing
it's
a lot
terrible.
of times that's the biggest problem. And you mentioned how expensive it is to go do like high fidelity video and that kind of thing. A lot of the times that's the trap, is you go and you spend all this money on video, or now the new thing is like VR, AR training content, and then by the time you get it approved, it's
like 6 to 9 months later. Yeah, and I don't know, like the VR AR stuff. I mean, I don't know if you'll comment on it, but like my take on it, I like it. I'm a fan of it. One of my close friends is a pioneer in the VR space in MedTech. But there's a part of me where I'm just like, it's like a shiny object to make things look cool, and it really doesn't add, it doesn't make the experience better technically. I mean, it makes it more interesting, but like, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I think a part of the problem is that a lot of that is driven by marketing. And I mentioned there are
They do like shiny things and over in marketing.
There are marketing problems in training, but you don't start with, hey, I really want VR content, so how can we work that into our training? You start with, what is your training outcome? Like, what are you trying to achieve? What kind of behavior are you trying to affect? And if there is something that you can use VR to do that with, and that's great. So like examples of that are VR is really great for simulating a high stress environment. So if you know that someone is going to have to perform under stress using your product, then sure, create a simulation that's going to mess with their workflow and lots of loud noises and flashing lights and whatever else it is. But ultimately, you want to figure out what challenge you're trying to help that learner overcome, and then build your content around that. A lot of the times, it's going to be quick references, especially on mobile, like quick graphics that help someone digest a lot of information really quickly. 2 to 5 minute videos, because you don't want to be sitting on your phone watching something for 15, 20, 30 minutes.
Yes.
And there is a place for that really high fidelity stuff, but it's just not going to be the most cost effective way most of the time.
I totally agree. And I just want to like highlight your point, because at least in marketing, they don't think about this. It's funny because like they're supposed to be good at user experience, but they don't apply it sometimes internally. But even myself, like with my own course, like when I first created some lectures, I realized some of these, like they're going to be 30 minutes long, 45 minutes long. But I was just like, that's nobody wants to sit for that long, not even me. And so I feel like dividing things out, like you're better off having 10 pieces that are going to be like 5 minutes long, right? Versus a 1 hour behemoth, right? Just like it's the same content, but like it's just so much better.
And that's what I see with pretty much every customer, is when we're tracking what content gets used. Sure, they have their course with all of the material, and they have their long books with the whole body of knowledge in one piece of content, but it's not what gets used. The first chapter might be what gets used. But then the most used content in the entire app is that 2 to 5 minute video, or that graphic that just helps them remember what they were supposed to do in the moment.
Yeah, totally. And actually, I want to highlight not we don't have any. It doesn't look because you've covered a lot of things in this short hour, and we really appreciate it. But Robin Christina Grandel, she's the marketing director over a really interesting company called Active Surgical. So Robin says great points on the balance between product quality and content longevity. Yeah, no, I totally agree.
So one other thing I'll share about that is,
yeah, please.
If you don't, or I'll frame it positively. If you focus on that quick, really effective, both in terms of cost and behavior change content, what it also means is that you can keep putting out new stuff. So like that's one of the things that you really excel at, Omar, where you're always putting out something fresh on social media. And so there's always something new for someone to come back to. So if you have a platform that makes it really easy to push out those new updates, send a push notification if it's relevant, or you're not worried about alarm fatigue or anything like that, but bring someone back to the training, share a best practice or something.
That's very interesting.
Re-engage with.
Yeah, no, that's actually a great point. And I think that's that one little nugget right there could solve a lot of issues with, let's say, like reduced utilization of an account, because if you have a mobile first app where you have these training videos, but you might have a section of like new techniques and stuff, and it could be, a rep with an iPhone shooting something that takes just a few minutes and just highlighting it, right? That might be the one thing that can re-engage a user for them to see a new video from somebody that they like a lot, or they admire. They're like, oh, I never thought about using the product like that. That's actually a really good point.
And not just re-engaging. So you mentioned the like rep holding an iPhone thing, right? This is like the perfect example to kind of bring everything home. We have a customer that has started getting their end users to mount an iPad in the operating room. And the reason they're doing that is because, one, the staff that they've trained for the in-service isn't there anymore. The nurses are gone, the scrub techs are gone. They just had rotation of staff. And two, they get these calls that are these urgent calls, and it's this is specifically for skin grafting. So, a case comes in and you have to do it really quickly because it's a burn case, and,
right,
it has to be done then and there. And they go, okay, well, luckily one of their reps filmed themselves putting together the device, disassembling it, cleaning it, all the things that they had to do from the point of view of the scrub tech. And now that video is just mounted in the OR, and they've had several successful cases that they wouldn't have been able to do if, someone otherwise hadn't flown out to Kansas City or wherever to get done.
Easy access. Robin actually has a really interesting question. Let me bring it up. So this is actually great. This is a great question, actually. Thank you, Robin. So Robin, over at Active Surgical, thoughts on the pros and cons of video training content being presented by the HCPs or healthcare provider, let's say a surgeon, versus employees. That's a really good question. What's your take on it?
Yeah, so this touches on a couple of things that we've talked about, right? So this is where standards-based content becomes really important, because if you can rely on the content on your training platform being standardized and being sufficient for anyone to stand up and train, well, then it's not just a healthcare provider. It can be a healthcare provider at your customer, right? It can be the nurse trainer, or it can be someone who's like kind of the captain at that location that's taking your content. Maybe they've taken your train the trainer course, and then they're able to deliver it to whoever needs it on demand at that location. On top of that, of course, a lot of times the practitioners are going to have a little bit more credibility when it comes to having these conversations with the end user. And so, sure, that might just be someone that you contract with that you're taking to each of your customers to share this information on your behalf. But it's going to be even more impactful if it's someone that end user works with, if it's someone that they have a relationship with, and it's someone that they know outside of this training, because then they're going to feel comfortable asking them questions. They're going to feel comfortable saying like, yeah, but what about this doubt that I have? And that provider is going to say, well, I've taken this train the trainer course, I've internalized this value proposition, and I can help you understand why that is the way it is.
Fascinating. Do you feel, the other thing I was gonna say is I wonder, like, you mainly deal with an industry, but are these things kind of transferable to, let's say, residency programs? Because that's the other thing, is that for new technology, like getting into a residency program, so people who are going through training get exposure to it. But I'm wondering, like, is that possible to translate it that way?
Yeah, it is. I mean, the biggest thing for residencies is that they focus really heavily on competency-based training. And so as long as you have a training system that can associate your your learning objects, your training modules or whatever with a competency, then you're usually halfway there. The other thing that we do to support that kind of thing is that you could be course complete as a learner. You can get through all of the content and it'll say, yes, you finished 100% of the content, but you're not going to pass the course until the instructor can go through the competency checklist and say that they've seen you demonstrate it in front of them. So that applies, to med device training, that applies to residency, that applies to police officers in the field that are being observed on some of their first few shifts. So residencies are very regimented and they're really good at holding people accountable to those competencies. But I would say that if you have the capacity, then having that kind of structure in your training program is going to work out well for anyone.
Perfect. Now, as we're getting wrapped up for the hour, and again, I know with your schedule, we really appreciate you joining the show. So I'm going to give sort of a last call to see if anybody else has any other questions. Go ahead and just drop it in the chat. But as we wait to see if there's any other questions, Colin, sort of final thoughts, closing thoughts for the audience.
Oh man, one thing I would say is that we learn so much from our customers. So anyone who's listening in that thinks that they might have a use case that they'd want to talk through about how mobile learning or distance learning might be applicable to their job, I would love to have that conversation with you. I mentioned Exerco that has the iPads mounted in the OR. That wasn't our idea. That was something that our customers came up with. We've seen things like the nurses that are doing their weekly rounds that have a book, a book that's published on our platform, and every week they add a new chapter, and that's their weekly update, and that's how they do their newsletter now. And it's just a really awesome way to have like a historical perspective of everything that they've been going over for the last year. And I think it's a really effective training model. And so there are all these things that, our customers bring to us and we go, you know what, that is brilliant. And I wish we'd thought of that. But because of that, if anyone here is listening and says, I wonder if this applies here, I wonder if this could help us with, an issue we're having with adoption or utilization or training dissemination, then I would love to have that conversation with you.
Got it. Fantastic. And it's such a good point. I think, the one thing that I've learned, at least in this year, like in starting my own company, is you learn so much the closer you get to the customer and trying to understand their pain points, how they actually solve things and everything. And, it never ceases to surprise me how once you get a hold of like a really good user, the kind of creative solutions they come up with that actually improve your own product. Well, I think we got all the questions answered that we want. I want to thank the audience, and for those who are going to probably message me as usual about a recording, the recording will be available. This is so we are live on YouTube and Twitter today as well, so you can go on YouTube right away and rewatch this or watch this on LinkedIn. And then of course we'll be publishing this on the State of MedTech podcast soon. So with that being said, let me bring up. There it is. So if you're interested in delivering high impact on-demand training, go check out Ology. You can learn more at ology.com. That's ALLOGY.com. And there's our CEO, Colin with one L. So be sure to follow him on LinkedIn. I know that Ology actually has a fantastic podcast on all things training. So be sure to check them out. What's the name of the podcast, by the way?
Training the Modern Workforce. Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. We have some really incredible people that are doing global scale training programs. So there's some good stuff out there.
Fantastic. Well, Colin, go ahead and stay on for a second as we sign off. And I wanted to thank our audience as always. This is another episode of the State of MedTech. I'm your host, Omar M. Khatib. And as always, have a great afternoon, have a great week. And be sure to review the show. I love I got to do a show just to read some reviews, but you guys have been leaving some fantastic reviews on Apple Podcasts. We're trending. Goal is to hit the top 10 or break into the top 10 by the end of the year. So we really appreciate it. All right, everybody, take care and bye for now.